Sarah Wilkins hunched over the fragile photo album in the dimly lit corner of the Millfield Historical Society's archive room. Rain pattered against the tall windows as October winds howled through the eaves of the century-old building. As the Society's newest genealogist, she'd been tasked with digitizing their extensive collection of baptismal records from St. Augustine's Church. The 1915 album lay open before her, its brittle pages crackling as she carefully turned each one. Her eyes burned from hours of scrutinizing faded faces and sepia-toned photographs. Most were typical group shots: proud parents, solemn godparents, and infants in elaborate christening gowns. Then she saw it, the June 1915 christening of Elizabeth Ann Caldwell. The composition was standard: parents flanking the priest, godparents slightly behind, all positioned stiffly as was common for the era. But there, in the corner of the frame, stood what appeared to be another baby in christening attire. Unlike the others, this infant's face was a blank smudge, as though someone had attempted to scratch it from the photographic plate. "That's odd," Sarah murmured, reaching for her magnifying glass. The distortion didn't look like water damage or chemical deterioration. It seemed deliberate. She turned the page, finding the July christening of Thomas Harold Jenkins. The same configuration of adults, a different baby as the focus, and there again, in the background, stood the same faceless child in christening clothes. Sarah's heart quickened. She flipped through more pages, scanning each photograph. August, September, October, the faceless child appeared in every group christening photo. Always peripheral, always with that disturbing blur where facial features should be. Her phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from the director, closing in 15 minutes. "Sarah, finish up for today." She snapped several photos with her phone, carefully closed the album, and returned it to its acid-free box. Outside, the storm had intensified, and darkness had fallen over the small Massachusetts town. As she drove home through sheets of rain, Sarah couldn't shake the image of that faceless child from her mind. Who was this infant that appeared in every christening photo? Why had someone attempted to obscure its face? And why did a chill run down her spine every time she thought about those empty, featureless smudges? She didn't realize then that her discovery would lead her down a path into one of Millfield's darkest secrets, a secret some residents had spent generations trying to keep buried. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the Historical Society before anyone else. She couldn't stop thinking about the faceless child. Sleep had eluded her, replaced by vivid nightmares of blank-faced infants surrounding her bed, watching with non-existent eyes. She retrieved the 1915 album and several others from surrounding years. The Society's ancient heating system groaned and clanked as she spread the materials across the large oak table. "You're here early," remarked Eleanor Prescott, the 78-year-old volunteer archivist who had been with the Society for decades. She hung her rain-spattered coat on the rack. I found something strange yesterday," Sarah replied, gesturing to the open album. "Look at these christening photos. Do you see it?" Eleanor adjusted her glasses and leaned close. Her breath caught audibly. "Oh my. It's in every photo from 1915, Sarah explained. "Always the same child. Always without a face. I wanted to check if this appears in other years." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she straightened. What an odd photographic anomaly. Probably just damage to the negatives. But Sarah noticed how the older woman's face had paled. The thing is, it doesn't look like damage. It's too consistent, and only affecting one specific figure in each photo. She'd already discovered the pattern extended through the entire year. 37 christenings, 37 appearances of the faceless child. "I'm checking 1914 and 1916 now," Sarah said, opening another album. Eleanor's hand shot out, closing the cover. "Perhaps that's not the best use of your time. The digitization project has deadlines." Sarah blinked in surprise at the woman's uncharacteristic firmness. "I'll get back to the regular work soon. Some things in small towns are better left unexamined," Eleanor interrupted, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Especially in Millfield." Before Sarah could respond, the front door chimed as Richard Bennett, the Society's director, entered with a gust of cold air. Eleanor immediately stepped away from the table, busying herself with arranging catalogs. Richard approached, coffee in hand. "Making progress, Sarah?" "Yes, but I've found something curious." She turned the album toward him. "Do you see this figure in the background? It appears in every christening photo from 1915, but the face is always obscured." Richard leaned in, frowning. His expression shifted subtly as he examined several pages. "Interesting. Probably damaged from improper storage before we implemented modern preservation techniques, in exactly the same spot across different photos taken months apart." Richard straightened, his smile not reaching his eyes. Early photography was full of quirks. Focus on completing the assigned catalog. We don't have resources for side investigations. as he walked away. Sarah caught Eleanor watching her with an expression that looked almost like fear. When their eyes met, the older woman quickly looked down. Sarah turned back to the albums. There was something here, something that made people uncomfortable. And now she was certain. This wasn't just a photographic anomaly. Someone in Millfield didn't want her looking too closely at the faceless child of 1915. After work, Sarah headed to the Millfield Public Library. If anyone knew the town's history, it would be Marion Blackwood, the head librarian who had curated the local history section for over 30 years. The library occupied a Victorian mansion donated by the Blackwood family in the 1940s, its Gothic architecture complete. With turrets and stained glass, it always seemed excessive for a town of Millfield's size. Sarah found Marion in the reference section, reorganizing microfiche files. At 65, she maintained the erect posture and precise movements of someone much younger. "Sarah, lovely to see you," Marion smiled. "How's the new position at the Historical Society?" "Fascinating. Actually, that's why I'm here." Sarah lowered her voice. "I found something strange in the 1915 christening records. A child that appears in every photo with its face obscured." Marion's hand froze mid-motion. "I see." Eleanor and Richard seemed unsettled when I mentioned it. "I thought you might know something about it." Marion glanced around the empty reference room before replying. "Come with me." She led Sarah through the library's maze-like corridors to a small office lined with filing cabinets. Closing the door, Marion extracted an old key from her necklace and unlocked the bottom drawer of a particularly aged cabinet. "The Millfield Town Council restricts access to certain historical materials," she explained, removing a thin folder. "Officially to protect privacy of certain families, but..." double quotes, she placed the folder on her desk. "What I'm about to show you isn't in any official record." Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Millfield Gazette, dated December 18, 1915. The headline read, "Caldwell Infant Grave Desecrated. Body Missing." Sarah gasped. Caldwell, the name matched the first christening photo where she'd noticed the faceless child. "Elizabeth Caldwell died of influenza in November 1915, 5 months after her christening," Marion explained. 3 days after burial, her grave was found empty. "That's horrible, but what's the connection to the photos?" "Keep reading," the article continued. "This marks the 7th infant grave desecrated this year. Town Council implementing night patrols at St. Augustine's Cemetery. 7 missing babies?" Sarah's stomach turned. "All christened at St. Augustine's in 1915. All appearing in those group photos you found." Marion's voice dropped further. "All of them died before their first birthday." Sarah's mind raced. "But the faceless child appears in every christening photo. Not just 7, because whoever took those photos knew which babies would die." A chill ran through Sarah's body. "That's impossible. How could anyone predict?" "There's an old story in Millfield," Marion interrupted, "about a woman who lost her child in 1914. They say grief drove her mad. She became obsessed with the idea that her baby's soul had been stolen, not by death, but by someone in town." Marion returned the newspaper to the folder. "According to legend, she cursed the families she blamed. Somehow marked their children for death. You can't seriously believe. What I believe doesn't matter. But people in this town, old families especially, they take it seriously. The christening curse, they called it." Sarah struggled to process this. "Why obscure the faces in the photos? Superstition. They believed the woman could only curse children whose faces she had seen. After the death started, someone, probably the photographer, tried to protect the remaining infants by obscuring their images. But that's ridiculous?" "Of course it is." Marion locked the folder away. "But 7 babies died, 7 graves were emptied, and a town was terrified. By 1916, no one would hold group christenings anymore." As Sarah left the library, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square. The rational part of her mind rejected Marion's story as superstition, yet she couldn't shake the uneasiness that had settled over her. What had really happened to those babies in 1915? And why was Millfield still trying to bury the story a century later? The next day was Saturday, and Sarah used her free time to visit the Millfield Cemetery. The oldest section contained graves dating back to the town's founding in the 1700s, including a corner dedicated to St. Augustine's parishioners. It took her an hour of searching through worn headstones before she found what she was looking for. A row of small markers from 1915, Elizabeth Caldwell, Thomas Jenkins, and 5 others, all babies who had died before their first birthdays. Each grave bore the same peculiar feature, a small circular depression where a photograph would typically be inset in memorials of that era. But these depressions were empty, as though the photos had been removed. "They took them all out after what happened," came a voice behind her. Sarah spun around to find an elderly man leaning on a cane watching her. His weathered face suggested he was well into his 90s. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," he said. "Name's Henry Thorne. I see you're interested in the 1915 graves." "Yes," Sarah replied cautiously. "I'm Sarah Wilkins from the Historical Society." His eyes sharpened. "Found those christening photos, did you?" Sarah's breath caught. "How did you know?" "Because I took them." He gestured to a nearby bench. "Let's sit. My legs aren't what they used to be." Once settled, Henry gazed at the row of infant graves. "I was 18 in 1915, apprenticed to the town photographer. I operated the camera for all the christenings that year." Sarah could hardly believe her luck. "Mr. Thorne, those photos show a child with an obscured face in the background. Do you know why?" The old man was quiet for a long moment. "That wasn't photo damage. I did that. Scratched out the faces myself." "But why?" "To protect them," he whispered. Though it didn't work for all of them. Henry explained that early in 1915, a woman named Abigail Winters had lost her baby to diphtheria. Abigail's husband worked at the mill owned by the Prescott family. Lenore's ancestors where safety conditions were notoriously poor. When the mill owner refused to pay for the child's medical care, Abigail's grief transformed into rage. She blamed the town's wealthy families for her loss, Henry said. Started showing up at christenings, watching from a distance. People said she'd placed a curse on the children of those she felt wronged her. "That's just superstition," Sarah replied gently. "Maybe so. But when babies started dying all from different causes, mind you, people got scared. I thought if I obscured their faces in the official photos, it might help." He shook his head. Foolishness of youth. "What about the grave desecrations?" Henry's face darkened. "That was the worst part. Someone dug up those poor infants. The town council covered it up, feared it would cause panic. They spread a story about wild animals, but ... double quotes, his voice trailed off. "Did they ever find who did it, or the remains?" "No, but rumors spread that Abigail had taken them for some ritual. Nonsense, of course, but people needed someone to blame." He looked directly at Sarah. "They drove her out of town. A mob went to her cottage one night in December 1915. She vanished into the woods. They never found her either." Sarah felt a chill despite the afternoon's sun. "Do you think she had anything to do with the deaths or the grave robberies?" "I've had a century to think about it," Henry replied, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "And I believe Abigail Winters was just a grieving mother who became a convenient scapegoat for a frightened town." As they parted ways, Henry gripped Sarah's arm with surprising strength. "Be careful digging into this. Some of Millfield's oldest families were involved in what happened to Abigail. They've spent generations burying that shame." Sarah watched the old photographer shuffle away among the graves, wondering how much of his story was true and how much was colored by time and guilt. One thing was certain. The mystery of the faceless child was far more complex and dark than a simple photographic anomaly. Sunday morning found Sarah back at the Historical Society, using her access key to enter when no one else would be there. Her conversation with Henry Thorne had left her with more questions than answers, and she was determined to find the truth. If Abigail Winters had been run out of town after being accused of grave robbery and cursing children, there should be some record, perhaps not in the official archives, but somewhere. Sarah began with the Society's restricted collection, housed in a climate-controlled room in the basement. These records required special permission to access, ostensibly due to their fragile condition. Now she wondered if there were other reasons some materials were kept from public view. After 2 hours of searching, she found a leather-bound journal labeled Town Council Minutes, 1915, 1916. Inside were handwritten accounts of meetings, including several emergency sessions held in the winter of 1915. The entry from December 20th, 1915 caught her attention. Emergency session called regarding the winter's matter. Resolution passed unanimously to exclude all mention of recent events from official town records. Marshal Peterson reports the Winters woman fled into Blackwood Forest. Search parties unsuccessful. Matter considered resolved. Citizens instructed to refrain from further discussion for the sake of public morale. Family names of affected infants to be struck from parish registry. The following pages had been torn out. Sarah sat back, processing this information. The town had officially erased what happened, creating a conspiracy of silence that had lasted generations. Another box contained financial records from the mill owned by the Prescott family. She found Abigail's husband, Thomas Winters, on the employee roster until February 1915, when he was listed as terminated deceased. The cause of death was recorded as accident machinery, so Abigail had lost both her husband and child within weeks of each other, both connected to the mill. Further searching revealed medical ledgers from Dr. Harold Jenkins, father of Thomas Jenkins, one of the deceased infants. An entry from January 1915 noted, T. Winter's severe laceration and crushing injury to right arm and torso. Prognosis poor. Mill accident. Treatment denied by Prescott management inability to pay. The pieces were beginning to align. Thomas Winters had been injured at the mill, denied medical care, and subsequently died. Weeks later, their baby followed. After that, Abigail began appearing at christenings, particularly those involving families connected to the mill or town leadership. Then the babies started dying. Sarah pulled out her phone and began creating a timeline, cross-referencing the christening photos with death records and town council minutes. A pattern emerged. The 7 deceased infants all belonged to families connected either to the mill ownership, town council, or the doctor who had refused to treat Thomas Winters without payment. She was so absorbed in her work that she didn't hear the basement door open. The sudden flick of the light switch startled her. Find anything interesting? Richard Bennett stood at the bottom of the stairs, his face unreadable in the harsh fluorescent light. Sarah scrambled to appear casual. Just getting ahead on the cataloging project. On a Sunday? He approached slowly. Alone? In our restricted archives? I wanted to understand the organizational system better, she lied, discreetly sliding the council minutes under a stack of papers. Richard's eyes drifted to the partially hidden journal, the 1915 council minutes. Going beyond photographic anomalies. Are we? Sarah realized denial was pointless. I spoke with Henry Thorne yesterday. He told me about Abigail Winters. Richard's expression hardened. Henry should know better than to spread old tales. Is it just a tale? Because these records suggest something very real happened, something the town deliberately covered up. You were hired to digitize records, Sarah, not conduct an investigation. His voice remained calm but carried an undercurrent of warning. 7 babies died. Their graves were desecrated. A woman was driven from her home by a mob after losing her husband and child. Sarah stood her ground. Don't you think that deserves to be acknowledged even a century later? Some history serves no purpose in being revived. Richard moved to the shelves, running his finger along box labels. Certain families and Millfield families that fund this society prefer discretion about their ancestors' actions. Like the Prescotts? Sarah challenged. Or the Bennetts? Was your family involved, Richard? His jaw tightened. My great-grandfather was mayor in 1915. He did what was necessary to maintain order during a difficult time by scapegoating a grieving woman and hiding the truth. By protecting the town from panic and preserving its reputation. Richard turned to face her fully. This conversation is over. Return those materials and leave. Sarah, we'll discuss your continued employment tomorrow. As Sarah gathered her notes, a chill realization settled over her. The cover-up that began in 1915 was still actively maintained, and she had just made herself an enemy of those determined to keep Millfield's darkest chapter buried. Despite Richard's warning, or perhaps because of it, Sarah couldn't let the investigation drop. After leaving the Historical Society, she drove to the edge of town where the Blackwood Forest began. A dense woodland that had once been much larger before development had reduced it to a few hundred acres. According to Henry, this was where Abigail Winters had fled when the mob came for her. If she had built a life there, perhaps something remained. The forest trail was slippery with fallen leaves, and the October wind whispered through branches nearly bare of foliage. Sarah had brought hiking boots, a flashlight, and a backpack with water and snacks, unsure how long her search might take. After an hour of hiking, the maintained trail gave way to denser undergrowth. Sarah consulted the old map she'd found in the library archives, which showed several homesteads that had once existed deep in the woods. Most had been abandoned during the Depression when families moved closer to town for work. The terrain grew steeper, and Sarah found herself climbing over fallen logs and pushing through brambles. Just as she was considering turning back, she spotted it, a clearing ahead where sunlight broke through the canopy. In the center stood the crumbling stone foundation of a small cottage. The wooden structure had long since collapsed, but the chimney remained partially intact, standing like a sentinel over the ruins. Sarah approached slowly, her heart racing. Could this have been Abigail's refuge? She began examining the site methodically, taking photos with her phone. Among the rotting timbers and stone, little remained to indicate who had lived here. Nature had reclaimed most of it. Then she noticed something odd about the chimney. One of the stones near its base seemed different, not mortared in like the others. She knelt and pulled at it, finding it came away easily, revealing a small hollow space behind. Inside was a metal box, roughly the size of a thick book, corroded but intact. With trembling hands, Sarah pulled it out and tried the latch. It opened with surprising ease. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but preserved by the relatively dry conditions of its hiding place. The first page bore a name written in delicate script: Abigail Eleanor Winters, 1915. Sarah sat on a nearby log and began to read. The journal chronicled Abigail's life following her expulsion from Millfield. She had indeed fled to the forest, eventually building this small cottage far from any trail. But contrary to town rumors, she hadn't died that winter. She had survived, and continued writing in her journal until 1918. The entries were heartbreaking. Abigail wrote of her double-lost husband Thomas and baby James and her fury at the town's wealthy families who had denied them care. She acknowledged attending christenings, watching from a distance, but not to curse, to remind herself of what had been taken from her. The most disturbing entries came from November and December 1915, after babies began dying. November 10th, they whisper, "I've cursed their children, as if grief could give me such power. If wishes could kill, would not all the Prescotts and their ilk have fallen when my James took his last breath in my arms? When Thomas bled while they counted their coins? No curse comes from me, yet I cannot deny a dark satisfaction seeing them taste the anguish they fed me." Then on December 15th, they are taking the children. I've watched them from the shadows. Not animals as they claim in town men, they come at night with shovels and sacks. I followed once. They took the small bodies to the old mill, to the basement where the furnace burns. What unholy purpose drives this, I cannot fathom. But I know who leads them. I have seen his face by lantern light. The doctor, Jenkins, who let my Thomas die. Whatever they do, it is not my doing. Yet I will be their scapegoat, I am certain. Sarah's blood ran cold. According to Abigail, the grave robberies were being conducted by men from the town, led by Dr. Jenkins, whose own son later died and was counted among the desecrated graves. The final entry, dated December 19th, was written in a hasty scrawl. "They come for me tonight. I heard them gathering at the edge of the forest, saw their torches. Whatever evil they have done, they will lay at my feet. I will flee deeper into the woods. If these words are found, know that Abigail Winters cursed no child, robbed no grave. I am guilty only of grief and the sin of being poor in a town where wealth buys both justice and truth." The journal ended there. Sarah sat in stunned silence, the forest quiet around her except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She had come seeking answers about a photographic mystery and instead uncovered what appeared to be a century-old conspiracy, one that had claimed not only 7 infants but also the life and reputation of a woman whose only crime was demanding justice for her family. As shadows lengthened across the clearing, Sarah carefully repacked the journal in her backpack. The truth needed to come to light, but she was increasingly aware that modern Millfield might be no more welcoming to that truth than it had been in 1915. The old Prescott Mill stood on the edge of town, a hulking brick structure that had been converted into an upscale apartment complex in the early 2000s. Millview lofts maintained much of the original architecture, including the massive brick chimney that had once belched smoke from the factory furnaces. After discovering Abigail's journal, Sarah knew she needed to investigate the mill's basement, where Abigail claimed the stolen infant remains had been taken. If any evidence remained after a century, it would be there. Getting access wouldn't be easy. The building's original basement level wasn't part of the renovation deemed structurally unsound. It had been sealed off according to town records. Sarah contacted a former college roommate who now worked in real estate development, asking about the building's original plans. By Monday afternoon, she had blueprints showing the complete layout, including access points to the sealed basement. That night, Sarah parked a block away and walked to the building, carrying a small backpack with flashlights, gloves, and her phone. The main entrance required a keycard, but the blueprints had revealed another option, a maintenance door near the loading dock that connected to the old service stairs. Using the lock-picking skills she'd learned during an archaeology field study where accessing old, abandoned structures had been part of the job, Sarah managed to open the door. The stairwell beyond was dim, lit only by emergency exit signs. She descended past the renovated floors until reaching a heavy metal door with a faded no admittance sign. It was chained shut, but the chain had enough slack that she could squeeze through the gap. Beyond lay the original basement, untouched by renovation. Her flashlight beam cut through darkness, revealing ancient machinery, workbenches, and support columns. Decades of dust covered everything, disturbed only by rodent tracks. According to Abigail's journal, the furnace room would be at the far end. Sarah picked her way carefully through the debris, the floorboards creaking ominously beneath her feet. The furnace room was sealed by another heavy door, this one partially collapsed inward. Sarah squeezed through the opening and found herself in a large chamber dominated by an enormous cast-iron furnace, a behemoth of the industrial age, designed to power the mill's machinery. The furnace door hung open, revealing a cavernous interior large enough for a person to step inside. Sarah shivered at the thought of what might have been burned here a century ago. She methodically searched the room, looking for any evidence that might corroborate Abigail's claims. Most of the space had been cleared during the partial demolition, but the furnace itself remained, too large and firmly anchored to remove economically. Behind it, Sarah noticed a section of wall that seemed different from the others, newer bricks, less weathered. She ran her gloved hand over the surface, feeling a slight give to the mortar. Using a piece of metal she found on the floor, Sarah began scraping at the mortar between bricks. It crumbled easily, suggesting it had been mixed poorly, perhaps hastily. After removing several bricks, she shone her flashlight into the space behind. The beam illuminated a small hollow in the wall. Inside lay 7 tiny bundles wrapped in deteriorating fabric. Sarah's throat constricted as she realized what she was seeing: the missing remains, hidden behind a hasty brick wall near the furnace. But why? If the plan had been to destroy the remains, why hide them instead? As she examined the scene more carefully, she noticed something else in the hollow, a glass bottle containing papers. Sarah carefully extracted it, working it through the opening she'd created. Inside was a rolled parchment, remarkably preserved in the sealed container. She gently unrolled it, revealing a document written in faded ink, dated December 14th, 1915. I, Harold Jenkins, make this confession in fear for my immortal soul. What we have done was not born of malice but desperation. When the Winters child died of diphtheria, I discovered unusual lesions suggesting a new strain. When other infants began showing similar symptoms, I feared an epidemic that could devastate Millfield. Council Chairman Prescott ordered containment at all costs. We removed the deceased infants secretly to prevent panic, intending to study the disease progression and ensure it had not spread to other children. When my own son Thomas fell ill with identical symptoms, I knew God was punishing my hubris. Prescott insisted we maintain secrecy, even as more children died. We used the Winters woman as distraction. Her grief-stricken appearances at christenings provided convenient explanation for the town's fears. When suspicion grew too great, Prescott ordered her removal. I can no longer participate in this deception. These remains must be properly interred. The families told the truth. If this confession is found, know that Abigail Winters was innocent of all charges laid against her. Our sins are our own. Doctor. Harold Jenkins. Sarah sat back on her heels, processing the revelation. The town leaders had covered up a potential epidemic using Abigail as a scapegoat. Dr. Jenkins had apparently planned to reveal the truth, but never did, perhaps prevented by the same forces that drove Abigail into the woods. The sound of a door opening somewhere in the basement jolted Sarah from her thoughts. Flashlight beams played across the outer room, accompanied by voices. Down here. The door has been forced. Sarah quickly photographed the confession and the hidden remains, then carefully replaced the bottle in the wall cavity. She had just retreated to a shadowy corner when flashlights illuminated the furnace room entrance. 2 security guards entered, sweeping their lights across the space. Someone's definitely been here, one said, pointing to the freshly disturbed dust. Sarah held her breath, pressing herself against the wall behind a pile of ancient coal bins. If they found her, she'd have no innocent explanation for breaking into the sealed basement. Check behind the furnace, the first guard instructed. As footsteps approached her hiding place, Sarah's phone suddenly vibrated loudly in her pocket. An incoming call. The beam of a flashlight swung toward the sound. Who's there? Come out now. Sarah knew she had no choice. She stepped forward into the light, raising her hands. I'm sorry. I'm a historian researching the building. The guards looked skeptical. At midnight? After breaking in? I can explain, Sarah began, but the sound of another voice from the doorway cut her off. No need, gentlemen. I know Miss Wilkins. Richard Bennett stepped into the furnace room, his expression grim in the harsh flashlight beams. She's working on a special project for the Historical Society, he continued smoothly. Though I did tell her to wait until we secured proper permission. He gave Sarah a pointed look. The guards seemed uncertain. She broke in, sir. Over-eagerness. A common affliction among historians. Richard smiled thinly. I'll take responsibility for her. Please don't report this. It would reflect poorly on the society. After a moment's hesitation, the lead guard nodded. Just this once. But you need to leave immediately. As they were escorted out, Sarah remained silent, confused by Richard's unexpected intervention. Once outside in the parking lot, away from the guards, she turned to him. Why did you help me? Richard's face was shadowed in the dim street lighting. Because I read Abigail's journal this afternoon. You left it on your desk. Sarah's stomach dropped. You went through my things? I was curious what you'd found in the forest. He sighed heavily. My family has lived in Millfield for generations. I grew up hearing whispers about 1915, but never the full story. They covered up an epidemic and blamed an innocent woman, Sarah said. I found the missing remains in Dr. Jenkins' confession. Richard was quiet for a long moment. The current Prescotts, Jenkinses, and others, including my family, have built their reputations on a foundation of lies. This will destroy them. The truth needs to come out, Richard. After 100 years, don't those babies deserve proper burial? Doesn't Abigail deserve to have her name cleared? He looked at her, conflict evident in his expression. What do you plan to do? Sarah straightened her shoulders. Publish everything. The photos, the journal, the confession. Let Millfield finally face its past. Richard nodded slowly. Then you'll need help from someone who knows where all the bodies are buried, figuratively speaking. He gave a grim smile. Meet me at the Historical Society tomorrow morning. There's more to this story than even you've discovered, as they parted ways. Sarah wondered if she could trust Richard's apparent change of heart. But one thing was certain. The mystery of the faceless child had led her to a truth that had been hidden for generations. A truth that would forever change how Millfield viewed its history and the powerful families who had shaped it. Sarah arrived at the Historical Society early the next morning, still uncertain whether to trust Richard's offer of help. She found him already in the research room, surrounded by boxes of records she'd never seen before. These were kept in my family's private collection, he explained as she entered. Records my great-grandfather removed from public access in 1916. You're really helping me expose this? Sarah asked, still skeptical. Richard ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair. My father died last year, still maintaining the family secrets. On his deathbed, he made me promise to protect the Bennett name. I thought that meant continuing the cover-up. He gestured to the boxes. But maybe protecting our name means finally doing the right thing. The records revealed the full extent of the 1915 tragedy. A diphtheria variant had indeed killed the first infants, but the subsequent deaths had different causes. The common factor wasn't disease, it was the photographer, Henry Thorne. I don't understand, Sarah said, reviewing the documents. Henry told me he scratched the faces in the photos to protect the children. He lied, Richard replied grimly. Look at these private council minutes. Henry Thorne was questioned after Dr. Jenkins disappeared in January 1916. The transcript showed that Henry, as the photographer's assistant, had been present at every christening. He'd developed an obsession with capturing the moment death touched a child's face, according to his statement. He believed he could photograph the shadow of approaching death, the superstition he'd learned from his grandmother, who claimed to see auras around the dying. He didn't obscure the faces to protect them. Sarah realized with horror he marked them. Richard finished. The scratched-out faces weren't to protect the infants. They were his way of identifying which ones he believed were destined to die. Sarah sat back, stunned. But that's impossible. How could he know? He couldn't, Richard said, passing her another document. But Henry had access to all the babies through his photography work. The council suspected he may have poisoned them to fulfill his own prophecy. The document was a medical report from Dr. Jenkins, dated 2 days before his disappearance. He had conducted tests on tissue samples from the deceased infants and found traces of a toxin derived from foxgloves subtle enough to appear as natural heart failure in small children. This is why Jenkins left that confession, Sarah murmured. He realized they'd been blaming Abigail when the real killer was Henry, and my great-grandfather and the other town leaders covered it up, Richard added. They couldn't admit they'd allowed a murderer to photograph their children while driving an innocent woman into exile. The town's reputation would have been destroyed. But you told me Henry was still alive, Sarah said. If he killed those babies, he was never charged, Richard interrupted. There wasn't enough evidence. The council decided a scandal would hurt the town more than a quiet resolution. They let Henry go with the understanding that he would never speak of 1915 again or practice photography. Sarah thought of the elderly man she'd met at the cemetery who had spun a tale painting himself as a superstitious but well-meaning young man. All this time he had been hiding a monstrous truth. We need to talk to him again, she decided. Get a confession after all these years. Richard nodded grimly. I already called the nursing home where he lives. He's agreed to see us this afternoon. Sunset Pines Retirement Home sat on a hill overlooking Millfield. Henry Thorne's room was in the memory care wing. Though the staff informed them his mind remained remarkably sharp for someone approaching his 100th year. They found him sitting by the window, his gnarled hands resting on a photo album. He smiled as they entered, but his expression faltered when he saw Richard accompanying Sarah. A Bennett, he remarked. Come to ensure old secrets stay buried. The opposite, Richard replied. We know what really happened in 1915, Henry. We know about the foxglove. The old man's face remained impassive. Do you now? Sarah placed the medical report on the table beside him. Dr. Jenkins documented the poison before he disappeared. You killed those babies and let Abigail Winters take the blame. Henry was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the town below. Finally, he closed the photo album and sighed. I was 18 and believed I had a gift, the ability to see which children would die young. My grandmother had the same gift, or so she claimed. His voice was steady, showing no remorse. When the Winters baby died naturally, I saw an opportunity to prove my ability. The foxglove was easy to obtain. It grew in gardens all over town. You poisoned 7 infants to validate a superstition? Sarah couldn't keep the horror from her voice. I chose them based on which families deserved punishment, Henry continued, as if discussing something mundane. The mill owners who worked men to death, the doctor who refused treatment to the poor, the mayor who turned a blind eye. I marked their faces in the photographs as my signature, and when they started dying, everyone blamed Abigail because she appeared at the christenings, Richard said. Henry nodded. She made a perfect scapegoat. A woman crazed with grief attending christenings, muttering to herself. When the graves were robbed, it completed the picture of a woman consumed by madness. You desecrated the graves? Sarah asked. No. Henry looked genuinely surprised. That wasn't me. I assumed it was Dr. Jenkins collecting evidence. Or perhaps the families protecting their children from further indignity. Sarah and Richard exchanged glances, both thinking of the remains hidden behind the furnace wall. What happened to Abigail after she fled into the forest? Sarah asked. Henry shrugged. The mob never found her. Most assumed she died in the winter cold. I never gave her much thought. She had served her purpose. The casual cruelty of his statement made Sarah's blood boil. You destroyed her life to cover your crimes. Many lives were sacrificed in the building of this town, Henry replied, unperturbed. The mill claimed dozens of workers before safety laws. The Spanish flu took scores more. My 7 angels were just threads in Millfield's tapestry of death. Angels? Richard repeated incredulously. You murdered children. I released them from a world of suffering, Henry insisted, a fanatic light entering his eyes. And I selected their families specifically, those who had caused suffering too. Others. Sarah realized they were speaking to a man who had spent a century justifying his actions to himself. There would be no remorse, no confession to bring closure. You won't get away with this any longer, she said, gathering the documents. We're publishing everything, the murders, the cover-up, Abigail's innocence. Henry merely smiled. After 100 years? Who will care about 7 long-dead babies or a forgotten woman? He gestured to his frail body. And I'm beyond earthly punishment now. As they turned to leave, Henry called after them. You know what became of Dr. Jenkins, don't you? After he left that melodramatic confession? They paused at the door. Check the foundation of the old mill's east wing, Henry said, his voice suddenly weaker. Poured fresh concrete there in January 1916. Prescott told everyone it was for additional support columns. But some of us knew better. He turned back to the window. This town was built on secrets. Dig too deep, and the whole structure might collapse. The revelation about Dr. Jenkins led to a grim discovery. After obtaining permission to investigate the mill's East Wing foundation, ground-penetrating radar confirmed a body entombed in the concrete, presumably Dr. Jenkins, silenced before he could expose the truth. With evidence mounting, Sarah and Richard brought everything to the current Millfield Town Council. The meeting was closed to the public but included representatives from the families involved in the original cover-up, the current generation of Prescotts, Jenkinses, and others whose ancestors had hidden the truth for a century. Eleanor Prescott, now revealed as a direct descendant of the mill owner who had initiated the cover-up, sat rigid as Sarah presented the evidence. Abigail's journal, Dr. Jenkins' confession, the medical reports showing poisoning, and photographs of the infant remained still hidden behind the furnace wall. These actions occurred 100 years ago, Eleanor finally said when Sarah finished. The perpetrators are dead, save for Henry Thorne, who is beyond prosecution due to his age and mental state. What purpose does exposing this serve now? Justice has no expiration date, Sarah replied firmly. 7 families lost children to a murderer, then were denied the truth. An innocent woman was driven from her home and likely died alone in the wilderness. And your families, she looked around the room, have built your wealth and status on this foundation of lies. Richard, seated beside Sarah, nodded in agreement. My family participated in this cover-up for generations. It's time to end it. The council debated for hours. Some argued that revealing the century-old crimes would only bring pain to the current community. Others worried about lawsuits from descendants of the victims. The most powerful voices belonged to those who feared losing status when their family legacies were tarnished. In the end, a compromise was reached. The Historical Society would publish the full truth, but with the town's cooperation rather than opposition. The infant remains would be properly identified through historical records and modern forensic techniques, then reinterred with appropriate ceremonies. A memorial would be created for Abigail Winters, acknowledging the injustice done to her, and Henry Thorne would face what justice was still possible. Though too old for criminal prosecution, his role would be publicly acknowledged, and he would spend his remaining days under house arrest rather than in the comfortable retirement home. 2 months later, on a cold December morning, the 110th anniversary of Abigail's flight into the forest, Sarah stood in the Millfield Cemetery as 7 small caskets were laid to rest properly at last. Descendants of the families had come from across the country for the ceremony, many learning the truth about their relatives for the first time. The story had drawn national attention, with journalists from major newspapers and television networks documenting what many called America's longest cover-up. Millfield's prominent families, including the Prescotts, had been forced to acknowledge their ancestors' roles in hiding the murders and scapegoating Abigail. Eleanor Prescott approached Sarah after the service, her face drawn with emotion. "My family has established a scholarship in Abigail Winters' name," she said quietly, "for students pursuing justice for marginalized people. It doesn't erase what was done, but ... it's a start," Sarah acknowledged. "What about the search for Abigail's remains?" The town had organized expeditions into the Blackwood Forest, searching for any trace of where Abigail might have died after fleeing the mob. So far, they had found nothing beyond the ruins of her cottage. "We'll keep looking," Eleanor promised. "She deserves a proper burial, too." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah remained by the 7 small graves, now properly marked with the children's names and the truth of their deaths. Next to them stood a new stone monument, in memory of Abigail Winters, 1890, unknown, wrongfully accused. Unjustly exiled, the truth will out. Richard joined her, placing a wreath of winter flowers at the base of the monument. "The Historical Society board voted unanimously to make you our new director," he told her. "I'm stepping down next month." Sarah turned to him in surprise. "But it's been in your family for generations. Perhaps it shouldn't have been," he replied. "Some traditions deserve to end." He looked out over the cemetery. "The town needs someone who won't flinch from the truth, even when it's ugly." "What about Henry?" Sarah asked. "Have you seen him since the truth came out?" Richard shook his head. "He refuses all visitors. The nurses say he spends his days staring out the window at the town, clutching that photo album of his." As they walked from the cemetery, snow began to fall, covering the fresh graves with a blanket of white. Sarah thought about the faceless child in those old christening photographs, how a simple photographic anomaly had led to the unraveling of a century of deception. The mystery had been solved, but the ripples would continue through Millfield for generations to come. Families were re-examining their histories, questioning what other secrets might lie buried in their past. The town would never view itself quite the same way again. And somewhere in the Blackwood Forest, perhaps Abigail Winters' spirit could finally rest. Her name cleared after 100 years of unjust accusation. 1 year later, Sarah stood before a packed audience in the Millfield Town Hall. The Historical Society's exhibition, Faces of the Past, Millfield's Hidden History, was opening to the public after months of preparation. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the complete collection of 1915 christening photographs, now carefully preserved and digitally restored. Alongside each image was the true story of the children photographed, both those who had lived full lives and the 7 who had fallen victim to Henry Thorne's twisted crusade. For generations, Millfield's official history was selective. Sarah began her opening speech. Comfortable narratives replaced uncomfortable truths. "This exhibition represents our commitment to telling the whole story, not just the parts that make us proud." The case had become a national sensation, featured in documentaries and true crime podcasts. Millfield had initially struggled with the attention, but eventually embraced its role as a cautionary tale about how power and fear could corrupt justice. Henry Thorne had died 3 months after the truth emerged, taking his last breath, still insisting he had done nothing wrong. He was buried in an unmarked grave at his family's request, away from the 7 children he had murdered. After the ceremony, as visitors moved through the exhibition, Eleanor Prescott approached Sarah with an elderly woman Sarah didn't recognize. "This is Margaret Collins," Eleanor introduced her. "She recently contacted me after reading about our search for Abigail Winters." The woman, who appeared to be in her 90s, clasped Sarah's hand. "My mother knew Abigail," she explained, her voice quavering with age. "Not in Millfield, but after in Laketon, about 40 miles north of here." Sarah's heart quickened. "Abigail survived?" Margaret nodded. She fled through the forest that winter but didn't die as everyone assumed. She made it to Laketon and took a new name, Eleanor James. The coincidence of the name matching Eleanor Prescott's first name seemed too pointed to be accidental. A final act of defiance, perhaps, taking the feminine form of her dead child's name combined with her husband's. My mother was just a girl then, but she remembered this woman who arrived during a snowstorm, half frozen and terrified. She worked as a seamstress and kept to herself, Margaret continued. Mother said she never spoke of her past, but sometimes woke screaming from nightmares about lost children. Did she have family? Descendants? Sarah asked, thinking of potential DNA matches to confirm the story. No, she never remarried or had more children. She died in the influenza epidemic of 1919. Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew an envelope, but she left something with my mother before she died. Mother kept it her whole life, and then I kept it after her. When I saw the news about Millfield and Abigail Winters, I knew it was time to return it. Inside the envelope was a formal portrait of a young woman holding an infant. Despite the photograph's age, the woman's face was clear. High cheekbones, determined eyes, a mouth set in a somber line. Written on the back in faded ink was Abigail and James Winters, 1914. Sarah felt a chill. This was the face that had been missing from Millfield's history, the woman who had been scapegoated and erased, reduced to a cautionary tale about a mad woman who cursed children. She looked so young, Sarah murmured. Mother said she aged decades in the few years she knew her, Margaret replied. Grief does that to a person. In the coming weeks, the photograph of Abigail and her baby would become the final piece of the exhibition, the face that had been deliberately removed from Millfield's visual record restored at last. That evening, after the crowds had departed, Sarah remained in the exhibition hall, studying the christening photographs that had started her investigation. The mystery of the faceless child had evolved into something far more complex than she could have imagined when she first noticed those strange smudges. Richard joined her, looking tired but satisfied with the day's events. "Did you see the latest from the forest search?" he asked. The town had continued searching the Blackwood Forest for any trace of Abigail, unaware until today that she had escaped to another town. "They found something at the site of her cottage," he continued. "Buried under the hearthstones, a small box containing her wedding ring and a lock of baby hair. The analyst thinks she left them as a memorial before fleeing." Sarah nodded, thinking of the young mother leaving behind these last tokens of her former life before disappearing into the night, hunted by neighbors who had already taken everything else from her. "We should move those items to her actual grave in Laketon," she suggested. "Now that we know where she's buried, we can give her a proper marker with her real name." "I'll arrange it," Richard agreed. "The Prescott Foundation will cover the costs." They fell silent, contemplating the exhibition they had created. What had begun as a historical digitization project had become a reckoning for an entire town, forcing Millfield to confront how wealth and power had corrupted justice, how fear had led to scapegoating an innocent, how secrets had festered across generations. "Do you think we've uncovered all of Millfield's secrets now?" Richard asked. Sarah gazed at the photograph of Abigail and her baby, the mother's eyes staring back through time with a mixture of love and determination. She thought about how easily this history had nearly been lost forever, preserved only through Abigail's hidden journal, Dr. Jenkins' sealed confession, and the stubborn persistence of physical evidence that refused to disappear completely. "I doubt it," she replied. "Every town has its secrets. The question is whether we have the courage to face them when they surface." Outside the town hall, snow was falling again, covering Millfield in a pristine white blanket that hid the complexities beneath. But now, at least, the truth about the faceless child in those old photographs had been revealed, and with it, a measure of long-delayed justice for both the innocent and the guilty. As Sarah turned out the lights in the exhibition hall, she paused at the door, looking back at Abigail's photograph illuminated by a single remaining light. For a moment she could almost imagine the young mother nodding in quiet acknowledgement, her story finally told. Her face restored to history, her wrongful accusation at last corrected in the town that had once driven her into the wilderness. Some mysteries were never meant to stay buried forever,